Hello, welcome to Musing Heavy, the site devoted to alternative reflections on hard rock and heavy metal. My name is Stephen Meyer, and today I'm going to be presenting some information based on an essay I recently put together entitled "The Need for Extreme, Dangerous Music, Even If You Hate Bands Like Celtic Frost and Mayhem." If you're interested to check this out in text form, the links are provided below, so please feel free to go to my website and check out this or any of my other essays. This particular paper is really broken into three main parts. The first part that we're going to deal with has to do with the subjective nature of extreme music as it applies to hard rock and heavy metal. In other words, what I might consider extreme, you might not think is extreme at all, right? And also related to this subjective idea of extreme music, most extreme artists have a temporal extent. And what I mean by that is what we might have considered extreme in the past, we might not necessarily consider extreme today or even in the future, right? So that's sort of the first part of the essay. The second part, although we are dealing with fairly subjective ideas here, again, what is extreme? That is a subjective idea. Still, I think there is still an opportunity to build sort of a little typology. In other words, what are the typical characteristics that lend us, that sort of lead us in the direction of why this band is sort of considered extreme and this band maybe not so extreme, right? So I think there's ways of categorizing this, even though it's a fairly subjective notion. So I'm going to endeavor to do that in this paper. And then the third main part is I make the argument, and I provide, I think, several arguments as to why it's good for heavy metal and hard rock fans, regardless if you like the extreme end of hard rock or heavy metal, that these bands do in fact exist. In fact, it's not only good for hard rock and heavy metal fans that we have extreme artists, I think it's good for society in general, right, that this occurs, right? So I make those arguments going forward. This is a two-part YouTube presentation based on this essay. And so let's start digging into it here in part one. So I will share my screen with you and you can read along with me or whatever works best for you. So again, dealing with this idea that extreme dangerous music is always going to be somewhat in the ear of the beholder, right? So in other words, it's subjective. So let's start there. So many groups categorized within hard rock and heavy metal have been considered extreme, at least for a period of time, right? So just to give you a few examples, and you may or may not even consider these examples I have in the paper as extreme, but many people do, just to give you an idea. So bands such as Venom, Slayer, the Sex Pistols, more of a punk band, I guess, but I always hear them as sort of a hard rock band, or they were. Marilyn Manson, some people considered Marilyn Manson quite extreme. Cannibal Corpse and Mayhem, most people will consider those bands extreme still today, right? And many, 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 many other bands are often given the tag of extreme. But that just sort of gives the idea in the hard rock and heavy metal world of the types of bands we're talking about, or at least for a period of time, many people consider these bands extreme, okay? Or maybe more generally, one might consider certain subgenres particularly extreme. So again, using the example of heavy metal, thrash metal, black metal, doom metal, death metal, grindcore, math rock, math metal. Often these entire genres, at least for many people, are considered the extreme forms of heavy metal. Right? Maybe not every band in these genres are extreme, but probably the majority are to many people's ears. Right? Okay, so if we go back in time a little bit and sort of building on this subjective nature of extreme, if we go back to the late 1960s, early 1970s, the music scene was not fragmented into countless subcategories like we have today, black metal, death metal, et cetera. These things didn't exist. In fact, the term heavy metal didn't even really exist. Most people tagged heavy music as simply hard rock. Or perhaps you would augment that term a little bit with descriptors such as acid rock or psychedelic or these types of things. But generally, it's hard rock, right? Yet even then, hard rock had its share of alleged extreme musical artists. So I'm going to start with the example of Jimi Hendrix. And that might surprise you a lot. Say, Jimi Hendrix extreme, especially by today's standards? You know, well, stick with me here, because you've got to consider this in its time and the reason I'm using the example of Jimi Hendrix is because it really sort of brings out this idea that extreme is really in the ear of the beholder, so to speak. All right. So many people, I'm sure, are familiar with Jimi Hendrix. Many applauded his guitar-based music as a revolutionary revision, yet still a logical extension of American traditional music. There are a few guitarists that have had a bigger impact on hard rock and indeed heavy metal than Jimi Hendrix. I think that's pretty indisputable. So lots of people saw, though, what Jimi did in the 60s and early 70s is really just a logical extension of traditional American music, i.e. largely blues. It was an extension of the blues, not particularly extreme, incredibly innovative, a gifted guitar player, like wildly gifted, but not really that extreme necessarily. Others did see Hendrix's music at the time as very extreme. Others heard his music as an outlandish variant, and to some, an unwelcome bastardization of the blues. So there were some who said, this is way too extreme. He's taking way too many liberties with the blues. This guy deserves to be on the periphery, so to speak, right? But it wasn't just Jimi's music that some considered extreme, others not so much, right? There were those that considered Hendrix as the focal point of the 1960s, well-intentioned yet largely benign peace and love movement, right? There were lots of other bands associated with that too. The Grateful Dead, the Jefferson Airplane, lots of folk artists, of course. But I think you could probably make the argument Jimi was definitely a focal point, if not the focal point, for this movement, for the happy hippies, so to speak, if you want to look at it that way. So again, very benign. A lot of people say, well, this sure isn't extreme. It's peace and love. It's good for the world, blah, 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 right? Other people, not so much. Hang on here. This isn't so benign. Others saw Hendrix's endorsement of a hedonistic lifestyle, replete with copious consumption of illegal drugs, as dangerous to impressionable youth. In other words, Jimi was extreme. Jimi was dangerous. His lifestyle set a really terrible example in the eyes of some for the youth, particularly his endorsement of a drug lifestyle, right? Which sadly was also his demise. So again, it depended on your point of view. Not just Jimi's music, but Jimi's lifestyle. Some saw it as, hey, it's a positive thing. It's the hippies, peace and love. It's all good. The world needs this. Others say, hey, he's promoting a lifestyle that people shouldn't follow. It's dangerous. He's extreme, right? And it didn't even stop there. Hendrix even exacerbated racial unrest in the eyes of some Americans. Now, I think this part was largely a US thing. Jimi, of course, was a worldwide phenomenon, but in the US, right? There was a political dimension to Jimi Hendrix that some people saw as dangerous. Okay, so again, we got to go back to when Jimi was initially happening. And the Hendrix audience has always been predominantly white, especially back in the 60s, right? And early in his short career, say around the time of Are You Experienced or Axis Bold as Love, his first two albums, 67, 68, right? Because so much of his audience was largely white, he had to endure accusations of sort of a passive turncoat vis-a-vis the Black community. Now, probably like lots of people listening, there's been a lot of information put out on Jimi Hendrix, and I've read quite a few books on him, et cetera. And by all accounts, this really bothered Jimi, that the Black community, a lot of them saw him as somewhat of a traitor, that sort of thing. And by all accounts, that really bothered Jimi a lot. So a couple of years later, Hendrix used his massive platform to publicly acknowledge the Black Panthers, which raised concern amongst various government organizations, including the FBI, over his endorsing of what many considered a militant, extreme, radical organization, right? So again, even politically, right? There were some who thought, hey, Jimi is a pretty extreme figure because he seems to be endorsing the Black Panthers, which some people in American society saw as quite dangerous. Right. So again, very subjective, depends on your point of view, right? Then for sure about Hendrix, but maybe even still today in some respects, right? So the extremeness of some artists like Jimi Hendrix really does depend on your point of view, right? And that's sort of what I'm getting at in this section, how subjective this really is. However, there's another dimension to this. There's a temporal dimension to extreme, right? In other words, some bands and artists are extreme at a point in time, and then that extremeness, if you like, kind of wears off over time, right? Two really good examples were at least initially two acts that were, I think, almost everybody considered extreme, at least at the time. Both fans and non-fans alike would be the example in the early 70s of Alice Cooper and Black Sabbath. Both were considered extreme and even a genuine threat to society by many individuals and institutions, especially religious organizations, as it turns out. Of course, Alice Cooper's chief instrument of vexation was an over-the-top, macabre stage show combined with, at times, very provocative lyrical content, which often was done very tongue-in-cheek, but at the time, nobody seemed to understand Alice's humor. So it was taken very seriously, and this guy who's chopping up dolls and cutting his head off and hanging himself and having songs like Sick Things, I Love the Dead, Dead Babies. I mean, this was just an outrage to a lot of people, right? This guy's extreme. He should be locked up, blah, blah, blah. Again, for younger folks who got into Alice maybe in just in the last few years, you think, really? You know, but yeah, at the time, he was public enemy number one, let me tell you, right? And Black Sabbath as well. While Alice Cooper was trying to deliberately provoke his audiences, and that was, I think, part of the plan in a lot of ways. I don't think Black Sabbath was ever trying to be deliberately provocative, but they were always considered kind of scary in their time. Sabbath alienated and or attracted with its doom-drenched and monstrously heavy music, apocalyptic subject matter, and alleged connections with Satanism. That last part was probably what made Sabbath the most dangerous or scariest, even though none of them were ever Satanists, not then and not now, but it didn't matter. People perceived it as such, right? So while both Black Sabbath and Alice Cooper are consistently recognized in hard rock and metal circles, if not musicologists in general, as extraordinarily important pioneers, and I don't think you can overstate the importance of Black Sabbath and Alice to the formation of heavy metal and hard rock. They are absolute foundational. There's no question about it. But the point is, at the time, they were considered very extreme, very peripheral types of extreme music and dangerous even, right? But the thing is, as I said, there's a temporal extent to a lot of this. Neither would be considered extreme by most of today's metal fans, and probably not by the general public either. They're kind of like Muppets now, like both Alice and Ozzy. And I don't mean that I mean, Ozzy has his reality shows. I mean, nobody would consider these guys dangerous at all, right? I mean, of course, I mentioned Ozzy Osbourne because, of course, he was the former lead singer of Black Sabbath. And here's the thing. Both Alice Cooper, who's just started touring again, since in the post-pandemic, well, I guess we're not over the pandemic quite yet, but he has been touring. But both Alice Cooper and Ozzy Osbourne as a solo artist, are still putting out roughly the same type of music they did in the 70s, or Ozzy sort of in the later 80s with his solo, early 80s with his solo stuff, right? Musically, they haven't really changed that much. I mean, if you look at their set list, they're still playing a lot of songs from when they were very dangerous, so to speak, right? And in terms of the stage show, Alice is still doing all the stuff he used to do that used to, drive parents and religious organizations crazy. Now it's just, oh, well, isn't that a nice little show, right? So things have changed so much, right? And I don't think anybody's put off by Alice Cooper or Ozzy Osbourne at all anymore, but at the time, believe me, in the 70s, nothing could be further, nothing could have been more different. These guys were considered dangerous. So often extreme music will have a limited shelf life as perhaps fans move on to something more daring. Alice has said on many occasions, you can't scare audiences anymore. It's impossible, right? Or wider societal tolerances adjust, right? And I think it was a little bit of both for Black Sabbath and Alice Cooper, right? People have up the ante, so to speak, of what's extreme compared to what Alice and Ozzy were doing in the 70s and 80s, right? And also people have adjusted to them. Admittedly, the fact that both Alice Cooper and Ozzy Osbourne have cleaned up their lifestyles considerably, I mean, especially in substance intake, et cetera, that's probably altered the public's change in attitude to some degree towards them as well. So there has been, I think, one change that's probably helped. But musically, as artists, they haven't really changed at all. It's society has adjusted to them, other than the fact their lifestyle choices now are a lot healthier. So probably that's working in their favor too, pushing them away from the extreme and more to the mainstream, I suppose, right? Okay, so can we actually Quantify extreme music then. So I've just sort of given you a few examples of how subjective this is or how it changes through time, right? So due to the subjective nature of what constitutes an extreme band or an extreme artist, a firm quantification scheme is not really possible. So I'm never going to be able to come up with a sort of a scheme that says, okay, if a band checks off all of these boxes, they are extreme. If they don't, et cetera. Can't really do that because this is very subjective. But I still think it's possible to more clearly articulate the situation and come up with sort of a little typology, I would argue, that here are the typical characteristics that sort of would lend themselves to us thinking, okay, that's definitely an extreme band, or they will be extreme for most people, and these bands maybe not so much, right? So again, broad strokes here. What are we talking about? What do most people in heavy metal and hard rock associate with extreme before I get into some specifics here? Well, in metal, most people associate extreme groups with very depressing music lyrically, and also the ambience of the music, I suppose. At times, the lyrics can be very violent, even gruesome, bundled with very dark and disturbing graphic packaging and presentation. So the lyrics are often very depressing. They can be violent, they can be gruesome. The album covers will depict that sort of idea as well, typically, right? And also showing up in t-shirts and what have you, right? And then musically, in a nutshell, I would say, I mean, I'm simplifying things here a lot, but for most people, musically, extreme metal bands are those that either play too fast or play too slow, right? I mean, again, I'm simplifying things, but probably that's not too far away from what's actually true, or how people perceive what's an extreme metal band versus one that's sort of more mainstream, right? So again, bands that tend to play really fast typically are in the more extreme subgenres, right? So good illustrations of bands who tend to play too fast for a lot of people would be certainly a lot of bands in thrash metal, right? Exodus would be an excellent example of that. Bands that play in death metal, right? Malevolent Creation would be a good example of a band that plays fast most of the time. Or lots of bands in the black metal subgenre, Emperor being a great example, right? Or bands on the other side, the bands that just play too slow for most people who like more mainstream music or mainstream metal, would be bands in the doom metal subgenre. Also sometimes people even break that up more into stoner metal and other types of metal, but doom metal, My Dying Bride, for example, would be an excellent example, right? Of a band that plays really slow, really, really heavy, but really slow. Sort of taking Black Sabbath and making it even slower and heavier, right? And then some bands will do both. They'll actually be too fast and too slow for most people at the same time, right? So some bands that are typically fast will also incorporate sluggish, doomy, or atmospheric segments or interludes. Incantation's a really great example of that. But then there's lots of bands in death, doom, and even thrash that will have sort of their very slow breakdown sections, et cetera, right? And again, just a quick note on this. I'm providing one example for sort of each of these genres, et cetera. You could probably, I'm sure the metal fans out there could probably say, well, what about this band? What about that? You could put in probably 100 bands in each of these categories that would be great examples, right? But what I did is I picked bands that certainly heavy metal fans will know these bands. I mean, you've got a bunch of their stuff in your collection, you probably know all about them, right? Or even the more, say, a metal fan that's a little more mainstream, you probably at least have heard the names, right? So I'm trying to pick bands that not only represent sort of what I'm talking about, but that most people, at least most metal fans, have at least heard of, or if not, are big fans of. I'm certainly a big fan of all these bands. All right. So when we talk about extreme music and heavy metal, in a nutshell, it's music that's nearly impossible to dance to. I mean, okay, I don't know, is moshing, the mosh pit, are people dancing in that? I guess maybe it's a form of dance. I mean, that might be an essay for another day. I'm not sure, right? But okay, so if you don't count that, it's not your typical sort of boogie kind of dance to kind of stuff, right? You can't, it's too fast, right? Or it's really hard to sing along with. I say somewhat jokingly, but I think this is try to karaoke Obituary without hurting yourself. I mean, not easy, right? All right. So again, you can't dance to it. You can't sing along with it. However, being excessively dark and playing at speeds usually outside the expected norm does not cover all possibilities of extreme music and heavy metal, right? Those are probably, when we associate what's extreme in metal, I think those are the things that will come to most people's minds. It's really dark, it's depressing, the lyrics can be gory, all that sort of stuff. The packaging can be kind of gross, all that sort of stuff, or disturbing, right? And musically, it's too fast or it's too slow, right? Okay. But I don't think those are the only possibilities of being extreme, right? Indeed, due to their vast musical complexity, many prog metal bands are highly challenging to most listeners. So a lot of people will consider prog metal as extreme, not because they're excessively dark or even that they necessarily play super fast or super slow, but because they're so incredibly technical, or they integrate forms of music that most people aren't used to hearing in metal or hard rock, that people will sort of push them towards the periphery, right? So good examples, again, just picking one or two examples here so people get an idea of what I'm talking about, but again, you come up with all kinds of others. Artists, metal bands that are highly technical, Dream Theater would be a great example. To some people, Dream Theater would be considered extreme. To others, maybe not. Right? But I'm saying that because they're so technical and because they incorporate styles of music that most people aren't used to, some people might say Dream Theater is more extreme. Or bands that play in all kinds of different time signatures and use all kinds of weird tunings and stuff like that. A lot of people would say Voivod would be a great example. In most people's books, at least for a good part of their career, Voivod was probably considered extreme. Not that they played particularly fast or slow, right? But because, again, their music was just so out there. Right. And a lot of that had to do with the time signatures and the tunings and all that sort of stuff. For a lot of people, Voivod was extreme, right? Or bands that routinely shapeshift amongst albums and even within particular songs. A good example would be a band called Between the Buried and Me. If you pick out sort of certain sections of the stuff that Between the Buried and Me do, you might say, well, that sounds pretty mainstream. And it definitely is. But the reason why this band would be extreme for a lot of people is because they kind of do everything in an album and even in a song. They're shape-shifting all over the place, right? So for a lot of people, like, whoa, I can't really follow this. This is pretty extreme, right? Okay, so those are a few examples of what types of bands we might consider extreme in heavy metal and hard rock. So I'm going to try to be a little more precise here and kind of, like, say, build this little typology of, okay, what are the typical, more general characteristics that will lend us to think, or will put us in the direction of why that we would consider this band extreme and why this band maybe isn't. So maybe this may be stuff you've already considered or thought of, but maybe never really put it in this sort of scheme. So see what you think of this. So part one, and I think this is the absolute prerequisite. If bands aren't qualifying for this first part, then I don't think we'd call them extreme. So here sort of see where this goes. The music may initially be difficult to assimilate, difficult to understand, or even difficult to tolerate by the fans, okay? Either in whole or in terms of crucial nuances. So what do I mean by that? Okay, so maybe the first time you ever heard Opeth, right? And you're a heavy metal fan, so you're a fan, and maybe you're just getting into Opeth, or say a band that's highly technical and started off as death metal, et cetera, right? You might not totally get it. Even though you're a fan of heavy metal, initially you might not totally get what they're doing. You got to listen to it. Certainly I do. I mean, I know people assimilate music at different rates. I'm the type of person, especially with extreme music, I got to listen to it a few times before I really get it, right? So initially, this type of music, even though you're a fan of it, you won't necessarily get it right away. It's going to take you a few listens and okay, now I sort of get it. Or if you're someone who assimilates music really quickly, you still might have to listen to it a few times to really get some of those key nuances and things like that, right? So again, or even if you're a fan of Opeth and you're kind of waiting for their new album, it still might take you a few less listens, even though you're familiar with their approach, to totally get what they're doing this time out, right? So like I say, it's not music you're going to get right away. It's not super catchy. It's not something, oh yeah, bang, a new Aerosmith album or a new AC/DC album. Doesn't take, I'm not knocking it. I love that stuff too. Doesn't take a lot of work to get that. Just boom, 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 and you're there, right? You only got to listen to the song once or twice. Maybe not even that. Maybe you just got to hear a chorus and okay, I know where they're going with this, right? But for fans, extreme music is not necessarily immediate. We got to dig at it. Now, if you're not a fan, that's a whole different story, right? Well, if you're not a fan of Aerosmith, you still might kind of dig it and tap your toe, etc., right? But if you're not a fan of extreme music, you're not gonna like it at all, right? However, extreme hard rock, heavy metal will be largely inscrutable and or utterly annoying to non-fans, right? So I think this is an important distinction of what makes music extreme or not extreme. The fans of this type of music, it'll take some time to really get what the band is doing, right? It won't be bang, bang immediate, at least for most of us, right? And if you're not a fan, you're not going to like it. This is a wall of noise. I hate this. I don't get it. I don't want to get it. Just get this away from me kind of thing, right? So in short, it's going to be the antithesis of easy listening, okay? All right. So this little typology I'm putting together, think of it as sort of a hierarchy. It's a cumulative thing, right? I believe all extreme bands in heavy metal and hard rock will have characteristic 1. And then a few others will have, of those bands, some will have characteristics 2. And then fewer still will have 3 and 4, right? So the rarest extreme band, if you like, will have all 4 of these characteristics, right? All extreme bands will have 1. Say most extreme bands will have 2, a few will have 3, and fewer still will have 4, right? But it goes the other way. If we can identify extreme bands that have characteristics 4, then they have to have all of the above almost as a prerequisite. So like I say, it's sort of a hierarchy, if you like. Okay, so what do I got in stage 2, if you like? Well, lyrically, most of the songs will be provocative, right? They'll be challenging. Often they're disturbing, sometimes they're darkly humorous, and they will rarely be politically correct, right? So now we're back again. The songs will be very dark usually, or at least they're set up to provoke, right? Sometimes the lyrics are going to challenge you, right? There might be some dark humor. Again, depends on your sense of humor. Some people don't see any of this as funny. Some people see it all as funny. There's lots of people who think Cannibal Corpse is really funny, right? For example, others are just totally put off and grossed out by them all the time, right? So it depends on your point of view. And they're rarely politically correct, which I think is great. More on that down the road kind of thing. But again, this is not the type of thing, you know, it's art and it needs to be treated as art, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to follow all of society's norms. But all art, good art should challenge. But like I say, I'll have more about this to say later about that. Okay, but again, lyrically, again, it's not your happy little love song kind of stuff, right? It's meant to provoke, it's meant to challenge, and it's maybe even meant to disturb you a little bit. Okay, again, especially if we're talking about in terms of extreme music and hard rock and especially heavy metal. Okay, then 3, right? So again, in the hierarchy, a subset of the bands will also have these characteristics. The presentation of the music will be over the top, particularly regarding live performances. And this can also include album sleeves, which will range from edgy to comically frightening to truly distressing, right? So there might be really elaborate and perhaps disturbing or over the top stage shows, or the packaging might be really disturbing and over the top, et cetera, in a lot of bands. Okay, and then 4th, and here's really where I think the point where music sort of crosses into real life, if you like, that the artist is sort of, they're sort of erasing the boundaries between their art and how they are as a person, okay? I'll have more to say about that coming up too. But the image of the band or the artist as portrayed away from the stage and away from the recorded music will seldom be considered normal, right? And can be depicted as either highly eccentric, antisocial, or in some cases criminal. Okay, so again, this is the smallest subset, I would say, but here's where bands again sort of cross a line for a lot of people, which we'll get into as well. So as I was saying, think of these 4 stages as like a hierarchy, and it's cumulative, right? So as I was saying, as such, it's unlikely an extreme group will feature traits inherent to stage 4 without also being characterized by the above 3, right? So you can think of these as levels of extremity if you want, or something like that, right? So I think most, if not all, extreme metal bands will have the first trait. If you can't describe them by at least stage 1, then they're not extreme, right? Then they're not an extreme metal band. So you got to have at least that, and then smaller and smaller subsets as we go from 2, 3, and 4. Okay. So again, just to generalize this a little bit, to give you an idea, okay, where do typical bands or typical subgenres fit on sort of this continuum or this hierarchy, if you like. I would say highly technical prog metal bands that I was meant. So bands like Dream Theater, Voivod, etc., will definitely impress, challenge their listeners with their musical prowess, right? Yet these groups feature lyrical content that's typically not that evil, right? Or not, the lyrics might be meant to challenge you and to educate you, but they're not really meant to provoke or to be excessively dark or that sort of thing, and definitely not considered dangerous, right? Primus might be an example of that, right? Primus, I think, is one of the most innovative. Again, maybe they're not heavy metal, but they're probably in the realm of hard rock. You might call them sort of prog metal in a way. But again, musically, they're giants, right? But they're not particularly dark. Their lyrics at times are sort of challenging kind of thing, but typically, again, they're here. And again, I think Primus is a great example of you got to really listen to them for a while to sort of get what they're about. You could argue Rush might be in that category too, right? Especially early Rush, that it takes a while to sort of get what they're doing. But Rush, again, lyrically amazing, but not provocative, not controversial. Not challenging maybe to a degree, right? But again, not particularly dark, etc. So a lot of I would say Dream Theater would be here too. A lot of prog metal bands or proggy hard rock bands, if you like, would be classified only by level 1, right? Maybe a little of part 2, perhaps. Maybe the lyrics challenge a bit, but they're not excessively dark, right? And they wouldn't have characteristics of 3 and 4 at all, right? Okay, what about thrash and death metal, right? Well, most thrash and death metal bands feature incredible speed, which both dazzles and limits their audiences, of course. And some of them might even rival the prog metal bands in musical abilities. I mean, when we talk about musical abilities, the prog metal bands are probably at the top of the heap. But hey, some of those thrash and death metal players are exceptionally gifted technically as well, right? So we certainly can describe most thrash metal bands and most death metal bands at stage 1. I think that's a fair thing to say, right? But I think if we look at thrash specifically, thrash kind of splits up. Some thrash bands are very dark and also embrace traits exhibited in stage 2 and 3. Slayer would be a great example of that. So if we go back to the hierarchy, right? Slayer, especially early Slayer, was way too fast for most people. So it was definitely at the periphery. It was definitely extreme in terms of speed. But then Slayer also had all kinds of songs that were incredibly dark. Their album jackets were always very depicted dark. They were, their music is openly satanic. It had all kinds of dark stuff going on. And the presentation of their music was over the top. Now, Slayer was never a big stage show band, so to speak. But musically, they generated so much power, right? That's all they really had to do, right? I mean, to this day, I've seen Slayer quite a few times. And to this day, I don't know that any band has generated the amount of power and energy that band has. I mean, they were really peerless at the time. I mean, of course, they've retired for the last few years. But again, even though they didn't have a big stage show, musically, they were just so intense that, again, you would have to say their concerts were over the top, at least early days of Slayer compared to what most other bands were doing, right? And again, their album sleeves were always edgy, very dark. The lyrics were very dark. Musically, they played too fast. So Slayer really checks off the boxes for 1, 2, and 3, I think, easily, right? But then other thrash bands aren't really, I don't think you could describe them as 2 and 3 at all. So I think of a band like Testament. I love Testament as well, but Testament's not particularly dark. Their lyrics are good, but they're not controversial to any degree. Even maybe Metallica you'd put in here if you still consider Metallica extreme. Well, okay, Metallica definitely was extreme early in their career. I don't know if they are anymore, right? But again, same sort of story. Bands like Testament, thrash metal bands, or early Metallica, I think easily fit in with number 1. Right. But I don't think you can describe them by 2 or 3 at all. They're not excessively dark. They're not over the top with their album covers and their lyrics, et cetera, right? So again, thrash, it depends. There are some really dark thrash bands. There are some lighter thrash bands, you might say, right? Okay. What about death metal bands, though? Okay. So death metal bands, to me, there's always similarities between the darker thrash bands and death metal bands. I'm not going to say exactly the same because vocally, I guess that's where the divider is. But again, they're sort of tapping into the same sort of vibe, I think, in a lot of ways, right? So while thrash metal has become somewhat polarized between light and dark, this type of diversity is much rarer with death metal, which also would include its close cousins in the grindcore category, I think, here. Because when it's death metal, here the vibe is pretty much uniformly violent, at least for lots of bands maybe evolve in different ways through time, but early on in their careers, that's almost a prerequisite of being death. You have to be dark and you have to be violent, or otherwise you're kind of not death metal, I guess you could say, right? So the music is brutally heavy, brimming with growling vocals, right? So the vocals, most thrash bands didn't use that. So I think that's probably the separator there. And the lyrical content, which is largely indecipherable, maybe you don't want to know what they're saying anyway, but it's hard to make out what they're saying unless you have a lyric sheet anyhow. And again, it's always dark and violent and etc., or almost always, right? So it can range from Killing Chronicles, 6 Feet Under is a good example of that, to unrelenting anti-Christian, anti-religious rants. Deicide is a good example. And of course, lots of other bands too. To impassioned protests and preoccupations with the inequities in society, Napalm Death would be an example of that as well, right? So again, I think almost every death metal band, if we go back to our continuum, is going to check off the boxes for 1, 2, and 3, right? So they're very similar to the darker thrash bands, right? The lighter, as I say, the lighter thrash bands, i.e. the bands that don't just dwell on the dark side all the time, are probably described just by one on this level, this hierarchy of extremity, if you like. Okay. I mean, again, I'm generalizing here a little bit. Take the band Death, for example, that incredibly important band headed by Chuck Schulinder, who died way too soon. One of the coolest innovators ever in heavy metal. Later Death, even though they were the epitome of death metal, really, probably you couldn't classify into 2 or 3 because they really got away from the dark side. Right. But the first couple albums, 100%, right? Death could be described by 1, 2, and 3, right? So again, there's some bands do progress if you want to look at it that way. Okay. Okay. So thus, some thrash and most death metal bands will almost certainly be described by levels 1 and 2, and most are going to be over the top, i.e. level 3, in terms of tremendously high energy live experiences, at least for death metal, and very explicit and disturbing packaging, which also is displayed proudly by many metalheads. As my creator t-shirt here is a little gross. So anyway, so yeah, we wear this stuff. A creator, a great example of a thrash band, at least early in their career, kind of obsessed with the dark side. Again, they evolved too through time. Okay. Interestingly, though, so you might say, so far I haven't categorized any of these genres or bands at level 4 yet, right? Most of the bands we've been talking about so far will not be characterized by level 4 in the hierarchy. It frequently surprises fans and non-fans alike how down-to-earth and normal most thrash and death metal players are, despite their sensory assaulting art. They talk about the darkest things on the planet, but as people, they're pretty just normal dudes and people that are pretty harmless if you met them at the supermarket or etc. I mean, again, probably like most metal fans, I've read tons of books on these bands and lots of YouTube presentations, and most of them are pretty down to earth, just normal folks that just happen to have partake in an art form that's particularly gruesome and violent, right? So again, if we look at 4 in the hierarchy, the image of the band or artist as portrayed away from the stage and recorded music will seldom be considered normal and can be depicted as highly eccentric, antisocial, and in some cases criminal. As I said, most bands, I'm generalizing here, of course, but most bands in the thrash, death, prog metal, right? Pretty normal folks, right? They just happen to have musically that's very extreme for a lot of people, right? Okay. So what bands can be described all the way down to the 4th level of the hierarchy, if you like? And here's where I'm going to talk about the 2nd generation black metal bands that I would argue is probably the apex of extreme. I don't think the 2nd generation black metal bands, I think they are the peak of extreme. A subset of these bands can most definitely be categorized by stage 4. And I don't think we've had a movement since the 2nd generation black metal that's reached that level of extremity since. And frankly, that's a good thing, I would argue. Okay, so let's sort of look into this a little bit. So at any given point in time, only a small number of heavy groups are likely to possess all 4 levels of extremity. As I said, all extreme bands are at level 1, then less 2, 3, 4. By the time you get to the 4th, it's only a handful that are going to reach that level, right? More often than not, though, the ones that have reached level 4, these have been black metal bands, more often than not, with those within the 2nd generation being the best illustrations, right? So again, before we talk about the 2nd generation black metal bands, I guess I should quickly mention what most people consider the 1st generation black metal bands, which I don't think ever got to stage 4. They were much like death metal bands and dark thrash bands that really checked off the boxes for 1, 2, and 3, but never got to 4. In other words, where art crosses into real life, okay? So what would most people consider the 1st generation black metal bands? Again, everybody's list is probably going to be a little bit different, but I would argue most folks are going to have Venom on their list, Bathory, Hellhammer / Celtic Frost, and probably Merciful Fate as the key originators of the black metal form. So these 1st generation black metal bands emerged in the early 80s and are united in achieving the first 3 levels in the hierarchy of extremists. So I think all of them got to 1, 2, and 3, right? But with no, especially early in their careers, right? Again, say in the first 5 years, but there's no evidence that any of them reached level 4, where their art crossed into real life, right? The key personalities that drove Bathory, Quorthon, right, who's sadly deceased some time ago. Hellhammer, Celtic Frost was Thomas Gabriel Warrior. I'll have a lot more to say about Mr. Warrior later in the essay. And of course, the key figure in Merciful Fate was King Diamond, who's also had a quite successful solo career, probably more successful even than Merciful Fate. And in Venom, I don't know that there's one key figure, especially in the original members of Venom. So you've got Cronus, Mantis, and or Abaddon. None of these folks were particularly inflammatory or offensive outside of their art. Within their art, they offended all kinds of people, okay? But as people outside of their art, again, pretty normal blokes by most indications, right? I mean, unless you want to count Venom's, I mean, there's lots of YouTube presentations of Venom being sort of drunken and buffoonish, whatever. I mean, maybe that's extreme for some people, but to me, that's kind of typical of the rock and roll lifestyle. They didn't really do anything that different, really, as people. Right. But when we get to a subset of 2nd generation black metal bands, right, and the best examples, not the only examples, but the best examples came from Norway, actually, in the 2nd generation. They most definitely checked off all the boxes in terms of extreme and separated themselves from death, thrash, and doom, their cousins, with a blatant willingness to be recognized as evil, not just in the presentation of their art, but how they were portrayed as people, right? So they definitely crashed into level 4, where art, art and real life basically were one and the same. And through actual murders, suicides, church burnings, grave violations, and other deeds of terror, these are or were musicians who attempted to erase the boundaries between the blasphemies presented in their lyrics, the violence portrayed in their music, and their conduct in real life, right? So that's what brings them to level 4. Some of the members in these bands actually committed these acts, right? So murders, suicides, church burnings, etc., right? And they died or were jailed as a result. Whereas other members of the inner circle of Norway's black metal scene promoted these actions, or at least saw no wrong in the behavior. So sort of complicit in a way, although they didn't actually do the deed, so to speak. So, I mean, you can always look this stuff up. It's available everywhere, really, if you're into, the darker side of heavy metal. Members from Mayhem, Burzum, and Emperor were convicted of crimes in the 1990s, but several other black metal bands that were close in time and space, so that were happening in the 90s and also were in that Norway scene, if you like, gained elevated eminence from the publicity and to some degree were guilty by association. So bands such as Immortal, Enslaved, Satyricon, Dark Throne were rightly or wrongly also categorized into stage 4 in this extremity sort of idea I'm putting forward, whether they embrace this deflected notoriety of the local scene or not, right? Again, So just to finish with this, a couple of qualifiers, and then you can seek out part two of this presentation where I'll finish off this essay. But as a fan of these Norwegian black metal groups, and I am a fan. All the bands I just named, I think, are terrific. I, as a fan, though, I have been able to separate art from person, even if the artists themselves didn't, right? Even though these artists went to great lengths to sort of merge the two, as a fan, I don't like what they did. Of course, I'm completely against any of the violations that they were convicted with, and even the ones they weren't convicted with, but if they did them, I have no time for that. But I'm not interested in how they are as people. I like their art, right? So as a fan, as a metal fan, I've been able to do that. I know there's other people out there who can't do that, and that's totally fine, right? I know of some metal fans that sort of like, I don't care how good their music is, they're criminals, and I don't want to support them because of that. I totally get that as well, right? And then there's other hard rock metal fans out there who would draw the line well before stage 4, right? So again, there's some folks out there like, look, as soon as these artists start committing crimes and are being that antisocial, hey, I'm not going to support their music. But I know there's other metal fans that would go further up the hierarchy and say, you know what? I don't like bands that have all the dark imagery, right? So I don't like bands not only at stage 4, but I don't care if you're not a criminal or not. You sing about killing, you sing about all this stuff. I don't want to hear about that. So I don't like extreme bands that are at level 3 or even level 2, right? So those would be fans. And I'm sure there's lots of folks out there too. And if you aren't, totally cool, right? That, they get off, Metallica, Testament, fine. But as soon as, they get really dark and all that, Slayer, Venom, right? And that's fair enough too. So every fan sort of has to make a choice, if you like, of where on the hierarchy they're willing to sort of partake as fans, you might say, right? And let's face it, the majority of music fans, I mean, the numbers would indicate this, right? When you look at album sales, download sales, concert attendance, etc., the majority of music fans, metal fans, hard rock fans, or otherwise, will still steer clear, of all extreme forms of hard rock and heavy metal, and even avoid bands at stage 1, right? So there'd be lots of fans out, the majority, frankly, that don't want to listen to extreme bands at all. So these are folks who are satisfied with Aerosmith, Kiss, AC/DC, maybe Metallica. Maybe Metallica is even too extreme for them. I'm not sure, right? Amongst all kinds of other bands, great bands. I love all those bands too, by the way. And they leave the weird stuff for the people on the, who for the minority, so to speak, right? But here's the thing, and I'm going to make this argument. If you hit the links, you can read the essay in its entirety in text form, or in part 2, I'm going to make the argument that even if you don't like, wherever you draw the line in this hierarchy, whether it's before stage 4 or you don't even want to get in the extreme hierarchy, even before stage 1, if you don't like this music at all, or you only like bits and pieces of it, I'm making and I make several arguments why it's good for everybody in heavy metal, and I would argue even society in general, that extreme music exists, right? That it's always to our benefit that we have artists out there that are, that live on the boundaries and are willing to push the envelopes, right? And that's what I'll pick up on next time. So thanks for checking this out, and be looking for part 2 if you're interested in this type of discussion. Take care.